Hello and welcome to Salesforce Architecture Talk with Gaurav and Satya. This is the place for all architects, consultants, and developers in the Salesforce ecosystem.
All right. Welcome, everybody. We are Salesforce Architecture Talk, your Salesforce architects, to bring you the best of the best Salesforce content. And in this series, the CTA Prep series, we are on episode 10. Gaurav, can you believe that? Episode 10, Integration Architecture. Personally, I've been looking forward to this episode for quite some time. We have a very, very special guest. I will not announce her name yet. I would want you to guess her name. She is a Salesforce celebrity and a CTA and a very good friend now. We have met a couple of times at Dreamforce, and I'm really, really excited for this episode. All right. So if you're joining for the first time, my name is Satya. I work for Google. I'm a CTA, and I started this pod along with Gaurav about a year ago now, just to make sure that we as CTAs are able to get more CTAs in this world. So our mission is to ensure that whatever we have learned in the process of our CTA journey, we give that knowledge back to the community as well.
Yeah, this is a very special episode. As Satya was mentioning, this is something that is very core to every architect, I would say. And we have been really looking forward to get this particular session ready. Just before we deep dive into the whole session, quick intro about the guest coming soon. About me, Gaurav Sood, Salesforce CTA from Sydney, Australia, and been in the Salesforce ecosystem from years now. And we started this podcast to share our knowledge within the Salesforce community. And here we are, episode 10. Really glad to be going through. It's been over 1 year, I think, Satya. So yeah, looking forward to this episode. And let's me introduce right away, Nadina.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Nadina Lisbon. I'm based in Maryland. I'm also a Salesforce CTA. I currently work as an enterprise architect at NetApp. I'm super excited to be here.
That's great. Welcome to the show, Nadina.
Thank you for having me.
Definitely. All right, let's get going into this particular session. Now, as you would have seen this particular pyramid and the journey in previous episodes, if you haven't, this is basically the journey of any architect who is basically learning or going on the CTA path. Then there are 8 different domains every CTA needs to get through, and today we are talking all about integration. So this is the main focus of this particular episode, but this is probably the most important domain for whole CTA preparation. We will deep dive into a lot of things in today's agenda. I think, as you can see, there are a number of things to cover. We definitely got Nadina on this particular episode. So we'll get to learn about her CTA journey, which is also a unique journey, understanding her why. After we have gone through the journey, all 3 of us will put all the brain power into the integration domain. So we'll get through the whole patterns, the different capabilities on Salesforce which are available, how to secure the integration. Once we have given basics about the integration, we'll take 2 use cases and we'll try to give you a view of what pattern can be used and why that pattern makes sense. After that, we'll just deep dive into a quick anti-patterns as we do in all the domains, that things you shouldn't do on this particular domain, and then we'll wrap up with the final thoughts. So that's today's journey. Let's get going into Nadina's CTA story. I'll hand it over to Nadina now.
Thanks so much, Gaurav. Yeah, so when I was writing out this slide, I was trying to figure out how to, kill this massive journey. So I split it up within the years, the beginning, my intense study, which was definitely 2021, and then my board ready year. I joke because I think I've been to the board so many times within 1 year. I don't know if other people have done this. But for me, when it really started, it started my journey in March. And that's when, it was right before pandemic. And I was thinking, if not now, when, if not who, me type of thing. And I didn't have all my prerequisites yet. So I very much had that big energy of, oh, I'm going to become a Salesforce CTA. Don't ask me how, didn't know when, and I didn't exactly know like all the steps. And so I knew I had to finish the prerequisites. And of course, the prerequisites at the time felt like a big deal, right? Like you climb that part of the pyramid. And then you get to the CTA prep, which is a lot more intense. So as I was going through, as I was doing those prerequisites, it definitely was something where I was very hopeful to be done and dusted by early 2022. But it was also something I knew that the more I studied and the more I looked into things, it was one of those where I'm going to need an additional bit of help. Yeah. So I remember when I was doing the prep course, and preparing where, it tells you this is what you need to do. This is what how you need to study. And there are a lot of people in my class, they'd already done mocks. They'd already had mentors. They already had coaches. And I was just like, how can I be behind when I just started? And so I remember going out to the Architect Trailblazer community, and I literally was like, I submitted my case, because back then you had to submit a case to even start the journey officially. And I'm looking for a mentor. And I remember Lawrence Newcomb reached out to me, and I was like super excited because it was like, oh, here's like another CTA. He had just finished. I now know that he didn't technically get his CTA on March 5th. That's just when they issued it. But for me, I took it as a sign because it was my birthday month and day. So I was like, oh, this is nice. A sign. Yeah. I also learned in that period, I definitely will need some more help. And so around February of 2021 is when I was like, okay, let me enroll in Flow Republic. And that really kicked off the intensity, because here you are, you have like this cohort of like-minded people. We all have the same goal of becoming CTA. We were studying very intensely. It was so intense that we had a lunchtime study group where every hour at lunch, we just talked Salesforce. And it was super wide, super deep, and we studied so much information. The amount of brain power on that call, I look back now, I don't even know how we were all able to do it. But when you start the CTA journey, you just make space for it. It just comes. And it was something where it was really good. And I'm very thankful that I had that group, because we were all able to really push ourselves and really get to it. And so when I went to go do my architect review board, the evaluation, I remember thinking two things can happen. I might fail it. And if I fail it, then I'll have some time to rest, because that time I was already a little burnt out. And then I ended up passing it. But the immediate thing came, it's like, I need to continue going. I need to find more energy now to keep going. And so I don't know how I was able to get through Christmas, because I told myself, like, your date might not come up so soon, but you need to keep studying. And then I got my date in February, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is like the final countdown. It was like big, intense. I took a bunch of time off from work, and I was really focusing on doing the exam. And that brings us into 2022. That day, I always tell people, it was like one of the best days. I don't know how to describe it. And I've only had those days on board days. All my board days have been really good. It's like everything was great. The presentation, great. Everything, like all that energy, all that work you'd put in, that day was just the best day. And I remember getting my results, and I was a little bit shocked, because it was like most CTAs, they'll say like, hey, the day went either really bad, or, there were a couple things where things felt like, oh, okay, I don't think I passed. But I felt really, really good that day. And so when I did get my results and I didn't pass that day, I was just like a little speechless, because it's like, this doesn't feel, and it doesn't feel like how I would normally feel. Because in my mocks, I would know if I didn't do well, or if that mock didn't go well, or like I didn't have the energy. So I used to try to take all of that into consideration. But that day I was at my best, fighting weight, energized, ready to go. So I decided to do the most obvious thing and roll the dice and go again for June. So when the date came up, I had to really think about it, because it's like, that's really soon. Should I go this early? Should I take a break? But I knew if I took a break, I remember like distinctly, I was talking to my husband about this. If I take a break now, the energy it would take for me to get back up to speed and get back up into the board ready would probably be more than what I would want to commit to. So I went, did the exam in June, and I didn't want to tell anybody how I did because I had another great day, great presentation. Everything felt really nice. It was like an amazing day of, I remember Sam, who's a CTA, he says it's like another day at the CTA office, and it felt so good. So when I got my partial pass, I was like, oh, okay, the judges really love to see me. So I guess I have to go one more time. And I remember between June and November, I had a lot of transformation happening. When I say a lot of transformation, I did a lot of things that most CTAs would probably not do, and I definitely do not recommend. But within that June and November timeframe, I switched jobs and I also moved. So I moved from Texas to Maryland. And I remember when it came up, I had the opportunity to either go on site in New York and do the exam or continue to do it virtual. And I actually chose to go do it in New York. I remember telling somebody, if I fail again, at least I'm in person and I can see them with my eyes. It was like, I don't know. And again, it's a partial, so it's not really a failure. But at that time, that's how it felt, because it was, why am I not able to cross this? I feel like I have that CTA energy. I literally have nothing else to give. I remember when the dates were coming up, Suzanne Ferguson, she had asked, like, are you trying to do this at, I think it was like maybe September. And I literally was like, no, I just changed jobs. I just moved. If a date comes up in September, I'm going to have to like deny it, which most CTAs would tell you like, no, because you want to make sure that you get that date. But that's the kind of energy I had. It was, CTA had been my whole life up until that point. But somewhere between June and November, I guess I crossed over into like CTA mastery is what I call it now. And it was like, it didn't matter where the exam was happening. I could do it in person. I could do it virtually. I just had to make sure I had that time so that I was mentally ready for it. And so when I went up to New York in November, I still hadn't unpacked enough. In fact, I had a special box called my CTA box that I carried with me when we moved, because we road trip up from Texas to Maryland. And I used to joke with my husband, this is the most important box. If anything else gets lost while we're moving anything or the moving trucks lose it, I don't care. I can replace it. But this box was the most important box. So we brought that box with us when we were RVing up. And when I finally went into New York and I went to do the exam, now it's tricky because it was a 2-section retake. It was data and solution. But I'd already known my focus needed to be on data. I knew it wasn't solution where I had went down. And so I focused a lot on data. I focused overall on solution. But now I'm doing this thing in 90 minutes. And at the time, it was one of those things where I just was able to get the 3-hour mark. No, you're telling me to do this in 90 minutes. And now looking back, the evaluation was 60 minutes and I was able to do that. So the 2-section was just another 30 minutes. And I did the exam. I remember doing the presentation. I remember being in person. And the way how I describe it is I'm cool and calm on the outside. But as I'm doing the Q&A, I'm like literally screaming in my head, like, remember to say this, remember to tell them this, take them on the journey. Don't internalize anything. And for me, I'm an introvert, so I think a lot deeply and then I say the answer, which is the overall process. But what I wanted to make sure I conveyed in November is, here's how we got from point A to point B. Here are my assumptions. And at this point, nothing is really wrong because you're studying, you know all the knowledge and you're very much in depth. And so I just wanted to make sure that the judges understood my point of view. And then if something needed to be corrected, we could correct it. But it was not the feeling of, oh, what if the judges are harsh or what if the judges are mean? I never had those feelings with my judges. I was always excited to present to the judges because for me, it was like, this is like a big deal. These like-minded folks. It was, C-level presentation. And so that's what brought me to November. And the day I got my results, it was a Monday. It was a Monday, I believe. And the first thing I was like, is there more that I should be doing? The moment felt so like climatic and I think I should be doing more. I think I should be doing more. And then I was like, is this real? Because all I have is this email. So I was trying to decide, do I tell people or not tell people? I don't know what to do, because like when I failed the exam, I was like, I don't believe I failed. And then when I know I'm passed, full on exam, I was like, oh, maybe I'll tell people in the morning. And then I was like, no, I'm just gonna wake up everybody. I'm gonna just tell everybody. And then when I finally posted is when I got like the actual cert, and I said, okay, it's definitely real. Now I can do the whole LinkedIn post and get everything out there. So yeah, that was my journey, and it was long. It was taxing, but my why was very much more of an inspirational, and I think that's what kept me going, because I didn't see a lot of CTAs that looked like me. There weren't a lot of female CTAs running around, and to be honest, when it was done and dusted and people were like, Nadina, you're the first Black female CTA, I was literally like, I don't know. I have to check, because I don't know if there are others on the journey. There's like not a good way to really check. And when I realized like, oh, I think I am the first, I definitely didn't set out to do that. But I know I'm now like a trailblazer and I've inspired other people.
That is such an incredible story, right? Just the fact that you're the first Black female CTA inspires so many people all around the world, not just here, right?
Exactly.
Everywhere in the world. So it's
Exactly.
really inspiring. Yeah.
Definitely. I think hearing your story, I was feeling the goosebumps, and I was literally thinking and reconnecting with our journey too. Like all the excitement and all that, it's years long journey, right? As in similar thing we have gone through, and there is uniqueness to every CTA journey, which you had, and then of course having a transition, moving across the states during your journey and thinking about it. I was like, and you would imagine,
that's so brave.
I have the same box. I have the same box sitting in my room still, in which I have all the notes and everything still there. So you want to just keep it close to you all the time.
It was my most important box. And I tell people, when I first started the journey, I had to have absolute quiet. And it used to take me forever because I was like thinking so much. By the end of the journey, I literally was doing mocks anywhere. It could be noisy. If it's loud, it like literally didn't matter the location. And that's how I knew I had like entered into this CTA readiness zone where I was already operating like a CTA.
And I guess the decision you made of going from a virtual to in person, that's also a very brave decision, because
I know a lot of people told me, why do in person? Why not stick to virtual? Because you've practiced virtual.
Yeah.
And honestly, for me, when I first looked at CTA, I really thought that's how it was going to be. I was going to wear my smart clothes. I was going to go into person in one of the Salesforce offices. I was going to do the presentation. I would do a little whiteboarding. That's what CTA was for me when I first started. Like, anytime you heard about people that said, oh, they did CTA, it was always that in person. But I know virtual has been really good for a lot of people, because now, you have access to do it. And sometimes it's hard to travel in person, because if I hadn't moved from Texas to Maryland, I don't know if I would have traveled all the way from Texas just to go to New York. But Maryland to New York was closer for me. So I was like, why not? Let's just go in person and finish this off.
Awesome.
And I guess you were in New York, so that was probably the best place to be in after like you get your exam and just de-stress yourself. Just New York is probably the best place. So that's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. Right after the exam, you have that energy where you feel like you can do another exam. But I literally just, my husband took me out for dinner and drinks. And I remember thinking like, if they call me back tomorrow and I have to like sit another exam, I would be totally ready. Because again, it was exciting, and you do a lot of preparation for that specific day. And I always want to tell people like, that day is your day. That day is about you. And I've always made it like, this is my big day. It's Nadina's big day. Nothing can go wrong on that day, because it doesn't matter if you have like some little tech issue, or maybe you felt like, oh, I didn't present well. I never have those types of feelings. And I think all the adrenaline I have that day as well, I literally would feel it building. I tell people that board day, I love it. The prep up to it is intense, but the board day itself is like one of the best days.
Exactly.
Such an important point for listeners listening is when you go and when you prep, when you have done so much study, and when the day comes, you have to internalize that you are probably the most prepared person on that day, and it is your day. So you need to amp up. If you feel like scared, you need to amp up yourself because you've put in the effort, and now it's just about showing up and bringing that energy to that room. It is
Yep.
such an important point.
And it's very easy to probably most of the candidates would feel that okay, this is such a big day just because you have spent years to
Yeah,
stand in that particular room in that moment and get nervous. So instead of getting nervous, get excited. I think that's
exactly.
Exactly. And
so you got to
yeah.
just get ready for that day.
Yeah, because it's, again, you've done the work, you've spent all this time preparing, and it doesn't matter. Like I tell people, I'm one of those people where, like, if we were running a race, until race day, you won't see me at my best. Everything leading up to it, I'm trying to make as many mistakes as possible. I'm trying to get all of that out because race day, I'm at my best. Anything before that, like, I had to give myself grace as I was doing this journey because I realized that I would, for example, I do a mock, and as soon as I go to present it, I would see all my mistakes and they would be on my face. And I'm like presenting and trying to correct real time, which is really hard.
Yeah,
And as I got closer to board date, I realized it's like, doesn't matter if you make a mistake, you can correct it. You're a CTA. Doesn't matter if as you're solutioning things change, right? You can correct it. You're a CTA. And it's at that day, you shouldn't be thinking whether or not you're a CTA. You should know that I have all the knowledge to be a CTA, and this is more of a formality. It's just another day in the CTA office.
Yeah,
absolutely. So this is fantastic because it is so important to hear when somebody is on the journey. It's so important to hear about this from a CTA who's been through that journey as well, right? You mentioned your study groups and accountability partners. Talk us through like a little bit more on that in terms of, you mentioned that you were meeting during lunchtime and talking Salesforce. How did that shape up your journey? How many people were there in your study groups, and how did the accountability partners help?
Yeah, so we were definitely a core group of 6. Our group was
6.
pretty intense because we had a lot of, I would say, project management. So we would have those meetings where we'd have a very specific topic, keep it very small. And then on Saturdays, we would do mocks. And as a group, we would all decide. So it didn't matter the time zone. We had some people in Pacific, some people in Central. We had one person in Canada. But we would all decide as a group, we will do mocks together. And then we would grill each other. Intense.
Right.
It was super intense, like deep. I always say if I'm in the hot seat, honestly, looking back, my group asked so many deep and technical level questions. And I think for us, the way how we did it, where we spent a lot of time gathering up all the knowledge so that we could then make our own mental models and not relying on something that was already available, was really helpful and beneficial for us. Because anywhere where you had maybe some weak point, it would all come back down to that fundamental knowledge. And so we would go back and study that knowledge to make sure we had it and then build upon that. So if like we were, example, if we're studying integrations and we had an issue where we didn't know which pattern to use, we would go all the way back to that integration white paper, look at everything again. People would create study cards. People would quiz each other, have these really intense, deep conversations. And then once we felt as a group we were good, we would move on to other topics. Now, throughout my journey, I did have other groups that I joined, some other groups that I led as well, but it really depended on what I needed at the time. So when I was doing my partial pass, like after I'd finished that part of my journey and focusing on data and solution, my last group, I really just focused on the data part because again, for me, I don't know if this was me in like CTA mode, but I was like, anything from a solution perspective, I can solution it. The weakness I had was data. So I really wanted to make sure that I got the archival strategy right. I wanted to make sure that anything from a data migration, it was deep and wide, make sure my data model was good. And from a solutioning perspective, it was like, once the data is together, the solution will come together. And if I need to make a change, I can make a change on the fly, because that was something as a group we tried to make sure we practice. We tried to make sure we didn't get into any of those fundamental traps on like what licenses to use and things like that, but really focusing on what is it we're trying to learn, what's the mental model we're trying to build, and then just overall build on that knowledge. And so even as I was coming up to my November exam, there was a period where I kind of just went silent, like people didn't hear from me. And that was more so to just turn down the noise, because at that point, I didn't want to hear about security. I didn't want to hear about governance, because I knew I wasn't going to be tested on them. But I still looked at those sections when I looked at my partial, because you never know what question will come from the judges, right? And so I made sure that, again, mentally, I was very focused and I knew exactly what I wanted. And I think that was a big difference between my June and November, right? I really worked on making sure, like, mentally, everything was good. I knew what I knew. And at this point, instinct had just become natural, because when you start the journey, I remember I told Johan this, when I did my very first presentation, it was flawless because I didn't know what I didn't know. So nothing felt wrong.
Right.
And then throughout the journey, you have to really build yourself back up, because now you know that you have all these mistakes. And so now my last presentation is very similar to my first presentation, with the difference being now I know, and I can make sure that I articulate and I have that clarity and really help the judges understand this is where we're at and this is where we're going. And by the way, this is my CTA boardroom, right? So that executive presence was very much strong.
This is a great story. I want to ask one other question, and I want to switch gears a little bit here. I want to go back in time to when you were like 10, 12 years old. And I want to know really Nadina at that age was like, did you always wanted to be like a technology person? Did you imagine yourself being where you are right now? So walk us through that Nadina a little bit as well.
Yeah, I think 10-year-old Nadina was thinking a lot of things. I didn't think I would be doing enterprise architecture. In fact, if you had asked me at 10 what I would be doing, I think at that point, I either wanted to, I guess it does fit in. I wanted to do three things. I wanted to invent something cool. Don't ask me what it was, but invent something cool. So I would always write down like these ideas and these inventions that I had. I wanted to be a scientist, but specifically, I was looking more at like astrophysics. So I was super intense and into like physics and astrophysics. And then I wanted to solve some big problem. If I really take all of that, by the time I got to college, I realized that like astrophysics wasn't what I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be like this cool job where you look at stars every night. And then I realized these people are doing a lot of paperwork. It wasn't for me. It wasn't for me. Invention wise, I never came up with like something big. So I still have a notebook out there somewhere where I write things down, but you never know. We still have time. And then solving big problems, that's what I do now as an enterprise architect, right? I solve problems for my enterprise. So one of the things I guess came true, but for me, I was very focused in the science, like the science field when I was younger, very focused on just, I think my upbringing was very interesting because like when my mom would ask me, what do you want to do? I didn't really have one thing, and she would tell me, just do everything. Do whatever you want. You don't have to choose right now. And so even now as like a Salesforce professional, I feel like I'm very generalist because I like to look at everything. I like to look at the entire platform. I like to look outside of Salesforce.
And that's what makes you a great architect as well, right? Because and this is actually very relevant to our topic today, integration, because Salesforce is never in isolation. You gotta integrate with multiple different systems. So I think that definitely makes sense, and that's what makes you a fantastic architect.
Right, exactly.
All right, that was awesome, Journey. Let's get going.
That is incredible. Very inspiring. Very inspiring. Okay, as I was saying, Salesforce is never in isolation. So any Salesforce project that we do, we always have some other systems, technology systems in the technology landscape that we are integrating Salesforce into. And this is what a typical Salesforce integration landscape look like. You would have Salesforce, the core, like Sales Service, Experience Cloud in the center. This is where most of the magic happens. And then there are these other products like marketing and commerce, which comes with inbuilt connectors to the core platform. But the data is hosted on a different technology stacks, right? Even with marketing or commerce, right? Marketing cloud, there has been talks about bringing it back on core with Hyperforce, but I think I don't know where that stands. But even having said that, these are applications. Their data set is different, so in some way or other, you have to integrate them into your core workflows, right? And then you use platforms like MuleSoft or any other middleware platform to integrate into other systems that may host your data, like your ERP systems, like your payment gateways, your data warehouses. So you can use a tool set, a toolkit really to bring in data into Salesforce if you need to, or have them integrated into your Salesforce instance so that you get that complete view of your customer or of your data, right? So that's what we're trying to communicate here. Any thoughts, Nadina, Gaurav?
No, I think all good here. I think it's just a general representation of any organization landscape where Salesforce is definitely not used in isolation. I think that's the main message, and integration is a key for successful implementation, which reflects back to the next slide, I think, where we want to talk about how and what integration patterns are. So definitely would love to
Yeah,
hear some thoughts on this.
absolutely. So, okay, so when we talk about integration, there are multiple ways you can integrate, right, with Salesforce, inbound as well as outbound. And if you have not seen this white paper from Salesforce, the integration patterns, I would highly recommend that you drop everything that you're doing. And if you're preparing the integration certification or if you're on a CTA journey, definitely go through this white paper, integration patterns, which talks about all the different ways that you can integrate. Now, this is not specific to Salesforce. This is general integration principles that you can take and apply to any integration strategy that you are working with. So these are guidelines and the types of integration that Salesforce that you can do with Salesforce, right, or with any technology systems. So I'll quickly skim through these and I'll jump in whenever required. So request and reply. This is a type of integration where you're invoking a process in a remote system, right, and you're actually waiting for the response. Whether it passes or is successful, you get the response in that transaction itself. So that's request and reply. Fire and forget is you're actually invoking a remote process and you get an acknowledgement back, but you're actually not waiting for that process to complete. You go on with whatever your workflow is and then have other mechanisms to get the response back. So that's fire and forget. Batch data sync, everybody was ever heard about it. This is asynchronous way of moving data from one system to another in a batch manner. So these could be inbound, outbound for batch, right? Remote call-in is very specific to inbound into Salesforce, where we have an inbound process to update data that may be hosted in Salesforce or mastered in Salesforce, or it could be brought into Salesforce and you're just updating it from an external system, right? UI changes based on data is where your UI is tied to data and UI is refreshed as the data changes in Salesforce. Again, the data could be residing in Salesforce itself or it could be coming from an external system. And then the data virtualization is where there is external data and you don't want to actually host the data in Salesforce. So the data is not persisted in Salesforce, but you want to have a view of that data in Salesforce. And a good example of that is something that sensitive data, right? You don't want to bring that into your CRM system and just need to just need to have a view of it, right? So use things like external objects to have this particular pattern in Salesforce.
Now, I think that's a very good summary. Thank you, Satya, for walking us through. I think the main, very common, I think these are some of the common patterns which we see when we are going through any Salesforce implementation. Now, on this particular side, we really wanted to expand on the declarative and programmatic tools available. Like we talked about request and reply pattern or bulk pattern. So how do we connect with Salesforce? So Salesforce API is available. You can definitely invoke Salesforce. Let's say talk about inbound. You can invoke those particular APIs and then get that data in from bulk operations perspective. And then of course you can also inject data. Now virtualization, virtualization is basically, as Satya was saying, we can actually virtualize external data within Salesforce. So Salesforce has this product Salesforce Connect, which is actually built on top of our data framework to virtualize external data, and then you don't need to technically bring the data in Salesforce. You can view the data, update the data, run reports on it. But of course, there are some considerations when you can't achieve some capabilities, then these particular integration pattern will not make sense. So understanding that is going to be very important. PubSub is very, I would say, last few years, 4-5 years, I think this particular area has expanded with all these different capabilities, where the async conversation is async integration is basically is heavily used now. Platform events, which are very heavily used in any Salesforce implementation, or CDC, change data capture, which help to push data off the platform. Let's say you have any particular process which is running in Salesforce and you want to sync the data, but you don't want customer to really wait for that integration to complete. You use platform event, put that data point on the event bus, and then your external system can consume the data. And that can be PubSub means you can have one data sent to multiple systems through this particular integration pattern. So, and then of course external API invocation, which is you are basically invoking external system. Again, can be request and reply, the very first pattern which we looked at. And Salesforce gives external services, which is nothing but completely, if you have an API which has Swagger specs, then you can just plug in that particular API through external services. You don't need to write code and just invoke through a flow. So simple configuration based integration you can bake in within Salesforce. So there are different tools available for different types of integrations on platform.
No, I think this was really good going over these high level capabilities, especially with the PubSub model. I think that's been very key nowadays, that this is how you can do these integrations and keeping that message super small.
Yeah, and I guess one thing I would like to highlight here is that Salesforce is an API first platform, right? Any data that is hosted in Salesforce is available right from the start via the API, right? So you create an object in Salesforce, there is automatically a REST endpoint created for that object. So and we'll see further in the discussion that there are some anti-patterns. A lot of folks or architects that I've seen is they go and create a custom Apex-based web service even when there is a standard API available. So just have to make sure that if there are APIs available, leverage them. And there is not one type of API that exists, right? There is a SOAP version of it. There is a REST flavor of it. Even with REST, there is bulk APIs to move millions and millions of records from Salesforce to and from Salesforce. So think about what your integration looks like, what mechanism fits, which pattern fits. First of all, that's a very important question to ask. And then another important question to ask is, does the data need to reside in Salesforce, right? It may not always have to. Can you bring it in on real time? use the virtualization and so on and so forth. So multiple ways to do integration in Salesforce. Security is super key as well, right? Which we'll talk about later in this session.
Awesome. That's great. Now let's get into integration architecture things to consider.
Yeah, so I'll take over here. So Satya, you brought up a good point, right? So when we talk about data in Salesforce and where does the data reside, I think there's like a couple of things we have to keep in mind here. Sometimes we cannot bring in the data because of, security, because of data residency. And one of the big questions I think we always need to ask and consider is, do we actually need all that data? And depending on who you talk to, they will say, yes, we need all that data. But most times, you probably only need a fraction of the data. And most implementations I've seen, it's more of, I need data for specific reporting, operational reporting. And then the rest of the data, I just need to access it periodically. So that's something to consider when, if that data does need to be in Salesforce and how much. And then when we talk about the integration patterns, again, is the data integration real time or batch? Now, most users, and this is something I always, whenever I hear somebody say real time, I'm always like near real time. I literally unmute near real time, because most users aren't really waiting around for that data. Most of the times they can wait for, sometimes they need the data within, let's say, an hour, but they don't need it in that immediate minute. And then when it comes to how much data, if it's a batch job, I know we've all probably written batch jobs or worked with something where we're putting in millions of data, or that system, we have to bring in that data overnight so that we can then do the work in Salesforce. So that's always key to consider. And then which pattern would suit it, it really depends. I always try to look at what the users are doing, but also know that the business process can be flexible. So what they might have been doing in, let's say, a legacy system that you might now be moving, they might not need to do that same process in Salesforce. This might be the time to actually help them upgrade and figure out, is this process even something we need to do? And then that real-time integration really turns into a process that can be scheduled on the hour.
Also, just to add to that, Nadina, I feel like the 99% of the time, at least in my experience, anytime I hear the word we need real-time access to the data, like real-time integration, it turns out that they don't need real-time. It's always near real-time. And in most cases, it could even be batch. Like, it may not even be near real-time. Like, I think there is a misconception sometimes when we talk about data. And I think you touched upon that point, is like not all data is needed at all times, right? That's where you need to think about, and this is where it ties into your data strategy as well. Like data, how much of your data actually should reside versus archived versus how frequently it is changing, how frequently it is moving. So data velocity really you need to consider. As an architect, these are some consideration whenever anybody says real time. Nope. Let's talk about it. That's the
I'm always like, I don't know if I've met a use case where it was real time. It's always been some slight delay, because again, users are working, they're doing a million different things across the system. So if you tell them to wait after a minute, they're like, where's the data? What am I doing? I'm going to go do something else. Whereas you can send them a message and be like, this has been updated, and that will typically work just as fine. So I'm telling you, anytime I hear real time, I'm like, near real time. Near real time. Let's just say together, near real time. Because I think when you tell people real time, they're waiting, and they're not actually waiting, right? It's like, oh, real time, but we need it like every 45 minutes, or we need it within the hour. So near real time. So there you go. And, that segues us into our mechanisms, right? There's always multiple ways to do an integration. There's many patterns, many APIs, what features we should use. Sometimes I know people look at, well, should we really do point to point? And sometimes you might have to do it. There are use cases when you might have to do it. Most times you want to go through an enterprise service bus, because again, who's consuming that data, where you're getting that data from, what are you doing from your strategy perspective? especially on big enterprises, you want to make sure that, yes, the data is not stale, but then at the same time, we don't have different results in different systems because that data isn't persisting across, right? So if you're getting the Salesforce data and you're doing more of high level reporting, that data should probably be in your data warehouse. And then you have your BI system that's looking at it and sitting on top of it, so that those reports that you're doing from like your enterprise level reporting will be very different than each individual application.
Yeah.
And volumes, limits, response times. Again, when it comes to data and moving data, there's always this like misconception, especially if we're retiring legacy systems. We need all the data right now. And as you dig into it, it comes down to we need a fraction of the data where we do everyday work and we do everyday activities. But in some of that reporting, you might just need it to, like from a financial perspective, you might just need it to do some financial forecasting or to do some comparisons over the quarter to quarter or sometimes even year to year. And so governor limits definitely play key because, again, as you're bringing all this data into Salesforce, are you ever planning to archive it? Do you have a strategy around archiving the data? What's the overall company's archiving process? Because you don't want to go against that. But then making sure that as you're calling this data, as you're getting it, if you're telling me you have to access 1 million rows just to make one decision, something might be wrong.
Yeah. And also, I mean, there might be certain scenarios like for compliance issues, you may have to store the data. The question is, do you need this data on the Salesforce platform? Because storing data in Salesforce core platform is actually pretty expensive.
It's very expensive.
Exactly. So every record on the Salesforce core consumes 2 KB of space, even though if you have one field in it or if you have 800 fields in it, right? So that is a very important consideration. So if you have a very, like if you have millions and millions of records, it's going to eat up your storage space as well, right? And that's just one limit you'll hit. Every data, yeah.
And if you have personal accounts, that's a whole other thing, right?
Yeah,
each one
exactly.
of those, that's 4 KB because that's the contact and the accounts. And so
exactly. Also, when you're doing APIs, there are HTTP limits as well. So you've got to keep them into consideration too.
Yeah, it's a lot to take into consideration. And data is very important, and integrations make a way to unlock this data, but we always want to keep these things in consideration. Security also brings up a good point, because as you're doing your integrations, you have to secure each endpoint to and from. You don't want, as you're passing this data, you have, if there's a bad actor to take that data, or worse, you have data leaks. There's too many stories out there going on now. So that's something you have to consider. So if you have a bunch of like point-to-point integrations, you're doing the security for each integration. Whereas if you have a middleware enterprise service bus, then you're worried about the security from your system to that middleware and then wherever else that data is going. So it is a one point of failure, but at the same point, you don't have to worry about so many security connections. And I think this is the most important one, the UX, because doesn't matter how beautiful you make that integration, you want to make sure that user experience fits with that integration. So if you told users and you had training and you had the change management and you said, by the way, you're going to get that data immediately, and then you realize that data is going to take about a minute or 2 minutes, even within that minute or 2 minutes, because of the world we live in where people expect, again, this is their real-time conversation. They expect something to happen. So even having just a simple message that comes across to say, we got your request, it will come back, you'll get a message when it comes. That type of experience can really help to, one, ensure the user doesn't get frustrated. And two, it allows you to make integrations that, again, they don't need to be real time. It could be near real time, just knowing that you've given that user a message. Now, in some cases, they might need that data to go on to the next task, and they're okay to wait. But we just want to ensure that you're designing a UI, you're designing a I'll say flow. I know flow is a Salesforce feature, but you're designing a flow that allows the user to really consume the data responsibly, but also ensure that you have time for that integration to write back. Because on peak days, you want your system and your integration to work the same as if it's a non-peak day.
Yeah, and how many
Exactly.
times you've seen on websites you go and you submit a form and then nothing happens, nothing's shown to you, and it's
No
just you see a
thank you, no
yeah, you
nothing.
see a
You don't
blank
know if
page.
it made it.
Those folks need to listen to this podcast, like
Yeah. That's always my worry. And then I immediately slam the system with two more because it's like I didn't get a
yeah,
message back. So
yeah.
did this actually happen? And then you get 3 emails later. Oh, by the way, you have submitted.
And they
Yeah.
have 3 duplicate records. So
Yep,
Correct.
it's
exactly.
in the end nobody won, right? Like, So yeah.
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 Gaurav, you wanna cover this? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think they were very good considerations, what we covered on the previous slide. There are some other aspects also need to be looked at when we are really considering or we are designing the integrations. Sometimes the integration specifications are really very well defined, or integration team is really running in a waterfall model. Like all the factors which we looked at on the previous slide, they were how to design and how to secure or what is the user experience, but the implementation sometimes can be waterfall. So I think we need to look at the timelines. Most of the Salesforce implementation runs in agile, right? So you want to deliver the value faster. But sometimes the integration team is running in a waterfall, so waterfall methodology, which means you need to uh, work around that particular timeline. So the next point is more or less build versus buy. There are many situations where you would see that there is some particular managed package which is available to achieve the same integration. Let's say for Zero to connect with Salesforce, you might think, okay, yeah, Zero already got the APIs available. I can just invoke that API. But if we do the research, there is already a managed package on Salesforce which is available. You plug in, put in your username, password, and endpoint, and then you are up and running with that integration. So you need to look at that. There are some packages which are available. Sometimes MuleSoft has a package which can speed up the whole integration itself. So build versus buy is also another consideration when we are really going through the integration itself.
So
The
on that, before you
yeah.
move on, I want to share a story. So I was with a customer in Australia. I won't tell names. And there was a Big Four consulting firm who was also engaged just to manage the data, and I was the Salesforce architect. And the Big Four architect, the architect from the Big Four company, came to me and said, "Hey, we are building an ETL tool to move data to and from Salesforce." And I was like, "Why are you building an ETL tool? There are heaps of ETL tools available in the market. Just use one of them." And that architect argued with me for 30 minutes.
Wow.
Why they building a bulk API connector is going to be better than using, let's say, Informatica or any of the ETL tools, though they have been in the market for like 20 plus years. Like how that is going to be better. So, and ultimately they ended up building a custom ETL tool, which obviously had lots and lots of bugs. But then
Yeah.
I thought about it and I was like, let me think of the incentives of this person, right? They are a consulting firm. They're probably charging $2,000 per day for their consulting services. If they build and they convince the customer to build an ETL tool, that's 2 months worth of effort. That was the incentive they were trying to just extract more money from the customer, which is what an architect needs to we need to question, right? Like look at
Right.
the incentives. What are we trying to do? Time to market. Every Salesforce project, as you were mentioning, agile, we want to deliver value quickly. Time to market is a very, very important consideration. Why would you build something when you have inbuilt tools, connectors already available if you want to go fast to the market, right? So just an interesting story I thought about when we talk about build versus build.
Yeah,
Definitely.
I feel like we all have those kind of stories because I had an interesting one again. I won't say who, but I remember we were using MuleSoft, but
Uh-huh.
where it started to get really funny was one of the standard connectors. It was an Amazon connector. I remember we had a special way on how we were sending the data, so it wasn't CSV, and there was so many passionate conversations. That's what I will call them about, oh, we should just build this custom connector because the way that you're sending the data, it's not out of the standard version. And I remember being on the call and saying, at the end of the day, our company has to be able to manage this. And if you build a custom connector, I can't bring an AWS person to manage this. What I can
Correct.
do if we use the standard connector, any AWS person in the company can manage this. But if we
Yeah.
use your custom connector, we're going to have to keep calling you back. And
Hmm.
what happens when we decide to bring on other different teams that want to use other different data formats? Are we going to build a custom connector each time? And then we're going to be in this technical debt.
Yeah.
And they were just like, well, no, we want to do this so that way everything is done in one go and it's one custom connector. And I remember saying it's one customer connector today, but it's going to be several by the time we finish building on. And our data team, they had asked at one point, like, should we change the format? And I said, no. At the end of the day, whatever format you're sending, we can consume it. And we just need to do one small tweak, but we should be able to use the standard connector. So if today you want to use a different format, we can change just one small part. And I remember the SI was very, they were at the end of the day, they were like, yes, this is what we're going to do. And at this time, I didn't know anything about MuleSoft. It was more very theoretical. I wasn't hands-on yet. But I said, there's no way. From a MuleSoft capability, you're telling me we have to go with a custom connector just to do this one piece. We're going to use the standard connector and then figure it out as we go. So that made me think of that story where, again, as I was, they were incentivized because the longer they would spend on the project doing this custom connector, the project actually finished on time. It would have been delayed by, I think, like a couple months, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
There goes millions of dollars.
Yeah, I lost a million, but that's okay.
Yeah.
No, definitely. Now, let's move to the next point. I think next 2 points are more important. I think let it be standard connector or a custom connector, you need to think about the testing. You need to do the end-to-end testing. You need to do the stress testing. Check if really that connector or the custom API or your platform is going to scale or going to work for your customer needs before the customer go live, which is going to be critical for the success. And then once you have built it, probably think about how to automate it, because down the line you will have situations where you will touch some particular part around the integration, maybe not the integration. Then every time there is a regression testing coming in. So think about how you can really automate that particular API implementation so that you can just go faster from your next build cycle. So yeah, these are the other bits to really consider when you are really defining and integrating.
Security. Very interesting topic. Again, integration is not a topic in isolation as well. This is one topic when you're doing your CTA, you have to think about data, you have to think about security for every integration that you are proposing as part of your design in the CTA, and not just CTA, in your actual life as well when you're working with the customer as well. The name credentials is a feature in Salesforce to use your authentication details define it in a declarative way, right? So that you don't have to keep defining it as you move from one environment to other. You can just deploy your name creds and go from there. Plus, there's a lot of complexity is actually simplified using name credentials. Right? Integration user. Ideal practice is to have a different integration user for every integration touch point. This is also an anti-pattern, by the way, where we use a single integration user across multiple different integrations. Ideally, you want to have a different integration user because of governor limits and transaction limits that may be imposed. The API only permission on profile or permission set is a very powerful one. If you have an integration user, make them API only because they don't really need UI access. That way, if anybody gets access to those user creds, they can't actually access the system itself. OAuth, OpenID Connect, industry standard protocol. I think everybody here knows what they are. Use that. Don't use username passwords. It's an anti-pattern. Try not to use it. JOT, obviously for system-to-system integration, a certificate-based mechanism to integrate when there is no user. You really want to use the JOT flow for your integrations. And SSL versus two-way SSL. So you want to make sure that your pipes are completely encrypted. Whether one-way SSL will suffice or you need a two-way SSL for more sensitive data is a decision that you have to make as an architect. In most scenarios, maybe one-way SSL would work, but there are certain scenarios where two-way SSL definitely is required.
Beautiful.
Any thoughts?
Let's quickly. No, I think that's awesome. Security.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's good. Let's go to the fun part.
Fun part.
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool.
Okay.
Let's talk about the scenario. Yeah. And then Nadina and Satya can help from solutioning perspective. Yeah. So scenario, use case is very, very common scenario. I think we do have scenario where now customers will need to do payments through their online portal. Let it be Experience Cloud. And then if the payment is successful, the invoice copy needs to be sent to customers in their email. So assume the API is available. Now, if that's the scenario, how would you think about the solution and what are the different patterns we can use?
Right. So I think let's look at it this way. Let's ground ourselves in this type of scenario. So for me, when I think about this type of pattern, I'm thinking of Amazon shopping, and I'm thinking about I'm getting ready to pay. I probably have too many things in my cart. So from a user perspective and doing that payment processing, I definitely, when I give that information, I'd like some type of check to come back to make sure that my payment was successful. So I'm waiting to make sure something happens. So it's definitely going to be more of like a request reply type pattern. And we would use an Apex Web Service call out here to do it. And specifically here with this payment process, again, as a user, when you give money, when you give your card, you definitely want to know, one, was this successful? Am I going to get my order? And then as a company, you want to make sure you send back a success or a fail. So again, want to make sure that you're getting your money. So definitely for this first one, for this payment process, it's definitely going to be request reply.
And I guess this is probably one scenario which warrants a request reply, right? As you said,
right?
Users waiting because it's payment, it's sensitive. So definitely a request reply.
Definitely. And then this is always a fun one, right? Where as we're reading through, now that the payment is successful, an invoice copy should be sent to their email. There's always going to be some ERP system, surprise. And when you're syncing data with these ERP systems, there's two things to consider. There's the sending the information to the ERP, but then there's also getting it back. Do we need to get back just a single invoice? And most times, no, you should never be doing that because that's very taxing on your ERP system. So for the first pattern, we would definitely do fire and forget, because once that invoice has been sent, the ERP will have it. Now, as you're throwing up and getting all these invoices from your ERP system, that's definitely where you'd want to do batch and have that data come back. The user doesn't need it specifically. In fact, it says they're going to get an email. So there's nothing where they're waiting for this information to come back. And then from an ERP perspective, there's no way you want to be hitting your ERP with multiple calls for each single invoice. So it's always better to batch and come back. And so the method here, we definitely do something like a platform event from Salesforce for your fire and forget. And then ETL batch we could probably use even like MuleSoft on the ETL side or other just pure ETL tools to do it.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I agree. And
Yep.
the natural response here is to do a request response, but this doesn't warrant a request response at all. This is a fire and forget or a
Correct.
batch.
Correct. Let's get to the next scenario. Now, again, this is a very common scenario you will most likely see in customer situation where the customer data may or may not be mastered within Salesforce. And let's say in this particular situation, the customer data is mastered within ERP, where Salesforce is possibly a new system which is getting introduced. And in many situations, you need to sync the data between ERP and Salesforce. So assume there are middleware tools which exist. Maybe MuleSoft is available for the integration. How do we tackle that scenario?
Yeah, so this one we'd split it up, right? So there's definitely two integrations happening here. So if we take the ERP to Salesforce side, again, you never want to be hitting your ERP systems for just a single request. So you always want to ensure that these things are coming across as a batch. So if somebody says to you, oh, by the way, we need to get that individual invoice each time, something is wrong. You've gone terribly wrong. Your ERP system and ERP team will hate you. So definitely a batch data sync. And again, it's going to be a heavy number of the data itself is, like you said, it's mastered in the external system. So when you're working with these mastering systems, you want to get as much data as possible, but be as gentle on these systems because they are the ones that are mastering the data. So they have a lot of things and a lot of transactions that they're doing. And we're always going to assume there's going to be a lot of numbers, even if it's a new implementation and you tell me we just went live and the numbers are low. We always want to look at scale and look at, well, what does next year, 5 years, 10 years look like? Or if it's an older ERP system, then that's a whole different conversation. So I always assume that it's something that you can do nightly, weekly, etc. Now, from a Salesforce to ERP, this pattern can be very interesting, right? Because Salesforce is really good at doing, I would say, fire and forget. Now we definitely can do outbound from Salesforce, and change data capture would be good because it can sync up with the data. In fact, there's a lot of change data capture methods that are out of the box, like on lead, accounts, and even orders. So this is something where you could definitely use Salesforce and the middleware together and have a good solution.
I think that goes in line with having declarative solutions as well. That you don't want to build an integration if it already exists. If there are multiple subscribers, so you can just publish
Right.
an event once and have the subscribers subscribe to the event bus and get those the data change events that you like, right? But I want to talk about the point that you made, a very, very important point is, and we touched upon it when we're talking about considerations, is even though the volumes are low today, 1 year from now, the volumes are going to get higher. So you're always designing for your system in the future and not for just for today, right? And that's where always think about, can I do this data movement in a batch manner? It's always going to be more efficient than doing request reply. Because even in request reply, there is other considerations, right? When you're doing request reply, you will have to do retries. You will have to do logging. You will have to do implement logging and auditing frameworks and make sure that data integrity is maintained. What happens if you retry and the packets are coming out of order? You will have to make sure all of this in your implementation. So always try and steer away whenever, going back to the same thing, whenever there is a real-time requirement, always push back on it to say, nope, let's do near real time. Actually, I would say take the other side, go batch, and if they don't agree, then settle on near real time, right?
Right.
So,
That's definitely something to consider, right? There's always very small use cases where you have the user waiting, like what we discussed in scenario 1, where it's like actual payments. That
yeah,
makes sense for definitely a real time. But anything else, typically you can do batch and you'll be okay. And the system will thank you.
absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. All right. Few of the anti-patterns to look at. Probably will rush through some of these particular points. We have covered a lot of these points already. Like when real time versus near real time makes sense. Number of users, whether many organizations use single user for multiple integration, which is probably definitely anti-pattern. Integration security, not optimal. Many times we have seen from dev perspective, people let's start with username and password, but that goes to production as well. So you would want to consider that open OAuth and OIDC is considered upfront, or probably JWT is considered upfront. And then when you are basically building the Apex Web Service, you are building for the same object for which the standard API exists. So we had touched all those particular anti-patterns. So careful of those particular patterns when you are designing the integrations. Final thoughts, Satya? Nadina?
Yeah, I think again we covered a lot. Again, integration is not Salesforce is not in isolation. It is always your projects. Even if you are launching a small project, at some point in time, you will have to integrate it with other systems. So make sure that you make this particular aspect of very it's a very critical aspect of your architecture. And integration in itself on Salesforce, as we said before, is not. It touches a lot of other domains on the platform, like data, like security, app design, your data model, data migration. All this stuff needs to be considered when you're talking about integration. Nadina made a very important point about user experience, like your integration and your application that you're building. You have to put your user at the center of your integration design as well. You cannot. It's not, even though it sounds very technical and back end, it's not, because at the end of the day, it's the user who's consuming the data. So you have to put the user in the center when you're designing these integrations. And we talked about testing, integration system integration testing, load testing, stress testing. These are all things that get lesser priority because they're not functionality. So they are always pushed to the sideline or pushed to the end of the project. And then, oh, we don't have time. We have a launch date. So let's just launch and we'll worry about it later. That is
Correct.
a no-go. That's a disaster. Don't do that. As a Salesforce architect, if you're listening to this, make sure that you make this a priority. All you have to do is plan it accordingly and have it in your project plan so that you can do all these activities. Well, we are at the end of it. I don't know how the time went by.
It went by really quickly. If I can leave folks with just one closing thought, as Salesforce architects, we're protecting our systems, we're ensuring that our integrations are written to the best of their ability. But also as Salesforce architects, things change on the platform. So make sure that you're plugged in with architect.salesforce.com, which has tons of information, prescriptive guidance. You're not always going to be able to find a CTA and ask them what they think. And so make sure you're building up your architect knowledge, not just on integrations, but overall. And architect.salesforce.com is where you should get started.
Shout out to the whole Salesforce architecture team who made all those resources possible. Shout out to Flow Republic as well. I think they have helped you a lot in your journey. And final shout out to you, Nadina, for coming on the pod. And fantastic. It was a very, very interesting episode. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you to all our viewers for listening in. And thank you.
Yeah, it was fun. I definitely will come back. So
yes, absolutely.
Definitely. Awesome. Thank you. All right. Speak soon.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
So with this amazing conversation, we conclude this episode. And thank you so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we enjoyed recording it. We look forward to bringing more exciting and relevant content in the upcoming episodes.